an entrepreneur is somebody who sees he's looking at the same problem or the same set of things as other people and sees the risk differently because they have either a unique insight or some unique information about that situation that they see the risk as being substantially less than other people do.
Being an entrepreneur is one of the most challenging career paths you can take. Something that Bryan Stolle, serial entrepreneur and founding partner at Wildcat Venture Partners, knows intimately. But that road isn't easy, even though today you see several stories reflecting those successes and entrepreneurial activities, which are now pervasive in our culture.
It's a completely irrational act of starting a company. The odds are completely against you. Nobody wants you. Nobody wants you to exist. Nobody has time for you, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to break through this tremendous amount of noise and inertia that exists. That's about finding the truth. It's about finding out what the market really needs and wants and what the market's willing to accept. And that's what's really key.
For Bryan, the exposure to all facets of entrepreneurship started early in his youth and continued throughout his career in technology. He's seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. So how has entrepreneurship changed over the years? And what does it take to be successful today? Welcome to the Strategic Momentum Podcast, the show where we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders on how to break through business and career inertia so you can better understand the business of work. I'm your host, Connie Steele. Between the draw of Silicon Valley and the success of shows like Shark Tank, it's undoubtable that entrepreneurship and startups are more trendy than ever. And in some ways, it's become an obsession. Some view entrepreneurship as an outcome, while others see it as a necessity or even as a habit and a practice. Technology has also seemingly made it easier to achieve success. But is that really the case? Bryan Stolle grew up under two generations of self-made businessmen, and that entrepreneurial spirit was deeply rooted in his youth. He always knew that he would start a company. In fact, Bryan has created more than $1 billion in realized liquidity for his investors as a founder of multiple companies. And as founder and CEO of Agile Software, Bryan led the creation of a new category now called product lifecycle management. Today, in his role at Wildcat Venture Partners, he focuses on investments in fintech, insurtech, proptech, and software as a service. In this episode, Bryan shares his perspective on the perceptions and realities of entrepreneurship, the myths and misconceptions that are still ever present, and what an aspiring or current entrepreneur needs to consider to create that momentum for success. We'll start with Bryan's childhood, which is where his entrepreneurial mindset really began to form.
Well, I was an oil brat, similar to a military brat, if you're familiar with the term, but father worked for an oil company. So up until almost middle school, I grew up around the world, places like Philippines and Saudi Arabia. So I started life with a pretty broad viewpoint on the world. And, having lived in third world countries or countries where, wealth was not widely distributed, where there's not a large middle class, definitely got to see the all aspects of human existence and condition. So I guess that's always been sort of a core fundamental part of my thinking and whatnot. Also, father and grandfather were both entrepreneurs, possibly back further than that. So that, I guess, mindset or that lifestyle is also something I was also exposed to on a regular basis. And probably part of what helped form the core of, I guess at the end of the day, probably a need to be independent, to have control of my own destiny, which, by the way, doesn't mean you're going to win. You suffer whatever consequences that occur based on your decisions, but at least you get to make those decisions. So that's, I guess, maybe fundamentally drove me. I've always also been a gadget geek, as my mother would say. We'd say tech geek now or nerd.
Which isn't nerdy anymore.
I know, it's cool now. I was, always enamored and fascinated with gadgets and whatnot. And in particular, for me, that drove me towards motorcycles. And I actually found a way to the paper routes and mowing lawns, et cetera, to buy a motorcycle at somewhere around 12 or so. And 13, and that led into dirt bikes, and that led into racing around with other kids, and that led into becoming a motocross racer, and actually eventually turning pro at around 17 or so. And so the aspect of that probably was very influential on me was, one, the independence my parents gave me to do it. They didn't approve, but their position was, if you want to do it, you're just on your own. So I had at a very early age learn how to make money to feed my habit, and also learned how to wear many hats, because I had to be my own mechanic, my own driver, my own race manager, my own racer, et cetera. And so it taught me a lot at an early age about how to manage myself and manage, a program and that sort of thing.
Also, I'd say it sounds like it's that early opportunity to marry this technical side and the business side as well.
Yeah, the other thing it taught me too, and maybe I already had it, but is the power and importance of self-learning. Because when you get a motorcycle, this is this mysterious machine, and how does it work, and what makes it go, and how do you work on it and repair it and make it go faster? So there was a lot of learning that I had to do, and so I was a pretty voracious consumer of any kind of information I could get my hands on. So learning how to be a lifelong learner, if you will, in the context of pursuing a passion, I think was also probably very helpful and useful.
Bryan also had a love for science fiction as a child and a teen. It helped him establish a more open-minded view of the world and envision the future in different ways, not just from a technology perspective, but also from a societal structures and cultures point of view. Having 2 generations of self-made businessmen in the family also exposed Bryan early to the realities of entrepreneurship. His grandfather owned the first Ford tractor dealership in South Central Texas, while also being involved with real estate. His father, on the other hand, not only had worked for large companies in his career, but also pursued several entrepreneurial ventures. He was always parallel pathing multiple activities or ideas. And while he saw that his dad was happier doing his various startups, he knew that freedom came with a different level of responsibility and trade-offs. All that insight and learning, coupled with having to self-fund his motorcycle interest, guided him as he took on every technical and business aspect of the sport. He learned a lot about self-reliance and motivation. But even though he was fueled by his racing passion, he came to a crossroad in deciding whether to continue to race professionally or go to college.
And I knew at the end of the day that some of my generalized ambitions weren't going to be fulfilled without a college degree. So I decided I tried to pursue both for a short period of time and realized that was not going to work. At the level I was competing, you have to practice and work at it every single day. And that's not possible to do that and go to college at the same time, at least not without a lot of financial support that I was not getting. So
great. So tell us about, from your experiences in college through then your professional career leading up to where you are now.
Along the way in college, actually I started out a molecular biology genetics major. And then the second semester of my sophomore year, I took a business law course as an elective, because I always had in the back of my mind and in the front of my mother's mind, I was going to be a lawyer or a doctor. And I loved it. And while I was intellectually stimulated, if you will, by the science and whatnot, there wasn't a passion there. And so I switched to business. And then as any good business student would do, I started looking at, okay, where are the opportunities in the future? And it became pretty clear that computers and software were, a huge opportunity. And so even while in college, I started orienting myself towards the software business. And when I graduated, I actually was fortunate to spend some time at EDS, which at the time was the world's largest systems integrator / IT consulting organization. I actually more or less helped create that whole category, founded by Ross Perot, for those who remember him. And, as was true of a lot of companies back in the day, fabulous training program, learned a lot, got exposed to a lot, was given a lot of skills. But I also felt like an MBA was going to be important to what I wanted to try and accomplish. So I did go back to grad school and get the MBA. And then from that point forward, I was always in startups. I went to work for a startup in Houston, a software company in Houston. Came in and took over their product management and product marketing and that sort of thing. And, that kind of was the start of my career in tech. So actually, every white-collar job I've had, not the pizza cooking and the chicken flying and the grocery bag sacking and the motorcycle part selling aside, all the white-collar jobs I've had were all in tech. So I was fortunate to get on that track and go from there.
While Bryan's time at EDS was invaluable, he had no interest in climbing the corporate ladder the same old way. His startup experiences gave him the opportunity to expand his roles and responsibilities and get that exposure to the entire workings of a company. And since he had always reported either directly or indirectly to CEOs, he also got to observe the good, the bad, and the ugly, up close and personal. Bryan learned a lot of lessons, both strategic and operational, around what to do and not to do, what's the right way to go to market, and what's the right way to organize for customer success. That eventually led him down the path of building a successful company himself, where he even created a new business category, all before becoming a venture capitalist.
And you eventually created a whole new category. Started a company, Agile Software, and which led to that creation of the new category that we all now know called product lifecycle management. So how did being in those startups lead you to ultimately creating this company and then subsequently you transitioning into venture capital?
Well, there was a thread. Actually, when I was getting my MBA, the program I was in still required a dissertation at the end, thesis. And I actually did mine. You could actually call it the first iteration of the business plan for Agile Software. I had already I was already working when I finished up my MBA, the last little part of it, which was the dissertation. And the company I got to work for had gotten involved in providing engineering management systems. CAD was kind of really just becoming a big thing back then, computer-aided design. And one of the consequences is all of a sudden a bunch of these design files were getting created all over the place and they're being changed all the time. And, obviously you don't want to build things based on the wrong design or the wrong plan. So managing that information became important, but very much from an engineering-centric point of view. That led, the short version of that is that led to me being recruited out to California by a company that had been backed by Sequoia and NEA and some others. And so I was recruited in there to run marketing and product marketing and whatnot and product management. And we had a pretty good run there, became arguably, certainly the largest independent, the market-leading independent company in that category. At the time, I think it was called Product Information Management, PIM, something like that. But it was very focused on managing engineering information. And one of the things that I learned, and one of the things I learned back at EDS was, as well as some of my education and whatnot, was just how critically important it is to listen to the customer. It all starts and ends with the customer. Just the other day, I have a company that was struggling with some issues, and they were asking about, how do we figure this problem out? And I said, look, it's really simple. Go back to the customers, talk to your customers, and really listen. It's that simple. I mean, it's not easy, and there's a lot involved in it, but it's that, the idea is that simple. Go talk to your customers. And so I very much did that. And one of the things that I discovered over time was, there's this big gap between engineering and manufacturing, or between the people who came up with the product ideas and the people that actually make them. And there weren't really many great tools for the people on the manufacturing side. There were these things called MRP systems at the time, which eventually morphed into ERP systems that kind of helped manage inventory and whatnot, but they didn't really help manage the information on the manufacturing side about what to build, when to build it, what's changed, et cetera. And I kind of learned there's this big gap here. And the company I was with at the time just didn't want to go pursue that direction or whatnot. and one thing led to another, and decided to leave, partner with some people out of a couple of my customers. So we were very much customer-centric organization we started, because they actually were the customers. And we started Agile to specifically go focus on this problem around manufacturing information, and the information, getting it from engineering, but managing it in a way that manufacturing could operate on and act against and whatnot. So, and that eventually left to creating this whole new category called PLM, or product lifecycle management. And I can I can assure you that there's tremendous value. As my partner Bruce Cleveland in his book "Traversing the Traction Gap" points out, there's tremendous value in creating new categories, but it is very, very difficult. The world people don't want to have to create a new space in their head for something. The world doesn't want something new as much as we think it does. There's always this resistance to anything new initially. And so it's a tough challenge, but very rewarding if you can pull it off.
Bryan's breadth and depth of experience has given him keen insight into what it means to be an entrepreneur. And from his own career journey, being that successful entrepreneur boils down to a simple premise. It starts and ends with a customer, no matter what your venture is, which is all part of understanding what the market really needs and wants. So while that premise will always be the same, and many of these principles of entrepreneurship are foundational, I wanted to understand what shifts Bryan has observed in the entrepreneurial landscape over the years, particularly given he's been able to see it evolve and grow since the days of his grandfather. You've been that serial entrepreneur. You come from a family of entrepreneurs. You have the perspective, this longitudinal perspective of entrepreneurship. So how do you feel the notion of entrepreneurship has changed over the years? Do you think there's maybe even a different definition around what an entrepreneur is today?
I think in a lot of ways, yes. It's become hip and cool to be an entrepreneur, right?
Absolutely. Shark Tank and all that. Everybody's obsessed with it now.
Yeah. But here's the reality. I always tell people it's a completely irrational act to start a company. The odds are completely against you. Nobody wants you. Nobody wants you to exist. Nobody has time for you, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to break through this tremendous amount of noise and inertia that exists. Part of the challenge with being an entrepreneur is you've got to make sacrifices most human beings are not willing to make. And when it's cool and hip and everyone, I'm going to go be an entrepreneur, people just don't realize just how big the sacrifices are that you've got to make. And, there's plenty of stories about entrepreneurs and the difficulties with their personal lives and relationships, marriages, whatever it is, being messed up, et cetera. Is you really do have to make sacrifice. And that's true of anything, whether it's great art or, a great building or, whatever it is. If it's something really great, it takes real sacrifice to make that happen. And I think that's where it really breaks down, is that people just don't realize just how hard it is and how much sacrifice has to be made. They get into it and they realize, oh, I'm not up for this. This is not what I had in mind. And I think the other part of it too is, the press obviously celebrates and the wins and the successes. And for every one of those, they don't tell you about the 1,000 failures, right? You don't hear about all the difficulties and, the challenges and the things that happened that weren't so good. And so the reality of what's involved really isn't clear, I think, to a lot of people. And, one aspect of that is this sort of instant success idea. For Agile, for example, we went from more or less zero to public in 4.5 years. Actually, Not even quite 4.5 years.
Wow.
We did that because there was zero wasted motion. There was zero wasted motion because, one, the first 100 people we hired all understood this problem and had a very specific cultural mindset that we were looking for and demanding. And every single one of those people was focused on doing this a different way and solving this problem a different way. And we're very aligned around that. And we knew what needed to go be built because we'd spent the last 10 years talking to customers and listening to customers. And so the success of Agile, the ability to go from zero to public in 4.5 years, was 20 years before that of experience and listening to customers and really understanding the problems, understanding how enterprises work, how they make decisions, understanding fundamental shifts in what was going on in the world, primarily at that time a shift from captive factories to outsourced manufacturing, which today is the standard and how people do it. But when we started Agile, everyone owned all their own factories, and contract manufacturing was just beginning to happen. So that's the other part of it, is that there are no magical, I had this idea and it suddenly worked and, life was amazing. Almost any great company that's been built has been built on, the back of a tremendous amount of prior knowledge, experience, and whatnot that just finally got applied to a problem in a little bit different way or had a different viewpoint that allowed something to blossom that up to that point hadn't been able to blossom because somebody didn't have quite the right mindset or understanding of how to make it happen.
Do you feel like today, with things rapidly changing so fast, and obviously you have technology that enables a lot of new opportunities to be created, the longitudinal data that's needed to evaluate the opportunity or see the opportunity is shorter, which may be one of the reasons why there's a different view on entrepreneurship, that it could be easier to have that instant success?
Well, number one, I don't think there is instant success. I think there is no such thing. I do think that, until recently, it was all about your experience and your instinct and kind of navigating through that. Now we're in a situation or a world where, with machine learning, artificial intelligence, you have the ability to test things and rapidly test and get answers and figure it out. And so, you can now run hundreds or thousands of experiments in the time it used to take, and before you maybe could run 10 in that same period of time, right? The one challenge to all that is those things require large training sets. So the challenge is, how do you get the data to be able to run these experiments? And how do you, and if it's on the consumer side, it's typically eyeballs and behavior on the web and behavior in an app and that sort of thing. In enterprises, it's actually not too different, although the clock speed is probably going to be a little different unless you have something where you can leverage very large databases that exist, like in CRM systems and ERP systems and other systems, systems of record that the corporation has that you can go get, pull out, and leverage and take advantage of.
So is it fair to say then, back when, say, with your father and your grandfather, where you didn't obviously have these large data sets, but during that time, that it was gut driven? Gut is a form of data, but the instinct and gut to help you formulate that opportunity, where now it's shifted to being more data driven, because you have that opportunity to do all these different experiments and give you those data points to enable you to pivot along the way.
No question. But I think at the end of the day, when I look at successful entrepreneurs and I look at companies that have had success, it's always this blend of really good data and really good insights. And those insights, were powered by the data, fueled by the data, but still involve some kind of intuition that put it all together, right? So I think the best entrepreneurs still are applying. If you ask 1,000 questions and you get 1,000 answers, you still got to be able to sort of synthesize that and put it together, right? Mm-hmm. And by the way, if you ask the right 1,000 questions, you're going to get much further than if you ask 100. Only 100 of those are the right questions, right? Absolutely. So even in the asking of the questions, there's insight and intuition, I think, that's involved, that at least at today's level of AI and machine learning, we're far from.
Absolutely. Well, so let me ask you another question too, around sort of the different types of entrepreneurship that has evolved from where there is the small business, the startup, which has been popularized quite a bit, right? That's the sort of sexy, glamorous thing that you see on TV. But you also have the large company type of entrepreneurship, which that intrapreneur, and social entrepreneurship. So how do you feel that has even changed the business landscape? Because I think most people, when they think of entrepreneurship, it is the sexy startup versus the fact that in almost every facet of business, you're seeing some level of entrepreneurialism occurring.
Yeah, the entrepreneurship in corporations is not a new idea, or entrepreneurship. My partner Jeffrey Moore, the crossing the chasm inside the tornado guy.
Mm-hmm.
He has this theory about it, which is, when large companies, incubators start something, everyone at first thinks, "Oh, that's really cute." Look at the little baby, and let's help out the little baby and whatever. But at some point, that baby if it's successful, turns into a teenager, and now they're consuming everything at the table, and that includes your lunch. And all of a sudden, this thing is now threatening your budgets, your head count, your power, your et cetera. And that's when the political knives come out, and they said that's why it's so hard for companies to innovate it. And I always like to talk about Apple and Amazon as the exceptions that prove the rule, which is the reason we are so amazed by Amazon and Apple, at least up until recently, and some other companies like 3M and some others, is because they are so unique. How their ability to innovate at that scale is very, very unique, and that's why we are so enamored by them or captured by them. So it's not a typical behavior, and it's very, very difficult for companies to do that. I will say that there's definitely been a shift over the last 10 years. One of my first investors at Agile was Sequoia, and I had the privilege of having Mike Moritz on my board. And Mike's a very, very thoughtful, insightful guy. He's also a brilliant, brilliant writer. And I remember after the bubble collapsed in the early 2000s, the first internet bubble collapsed, he wrote a letter to investors and the like. And at one point he talked about, in terms of talking about corporate venture that had sort of sprung up in the late 90s, he said, now that all the tourists have left, and referring to the fact that, the corporations just, it was fun and all good games when, the market was up and to the right, but as soon as that stopped, then, all the corporations kind of pulled back. Well, the difference now is the tourists are back, only they've come with their, immigration papers, and they're here to stay. Almost every large company now, I think, has a venture arm. Mm-hmm. And it's there. It's there to stay. I don't think they're going away. And it's all about helping them get insight into where things are going, and to understand trends and to understand technologies they can leverage. And, how well they'll be able to bring that into the organization, how well they'll be able to leverage, that's probably still TBD in a lot of ways. There's still a lot of learning how to do that efficiently and effectively and well. And the ones that do will probably become the winners, and the ones that don't will fall behind. But much as the pharmaceutical industry these days, much of their drug pipeline is actually from acquisition, not from internal development. And Cisco played a very similar game. Actually, back in the day, much of Cisco's growth was fueled by acquiring other companies, often engineers who left Cisco because they saw some opportunity that Cisco just didn't have the time to deal with, and they built those into big, into companies, and then Cisco bought them back. So, it's proven to be a good way to build real value and whatnot. But I think that's definitely having an impact on the venture landscape and on entrepreneurism. But I think it'll be less about entrepreneurship and more about how do you become really good at scouting out and finding these opportunities, and then figuring out how to work effectively with them and or acquire them and integrate them into your business. On the social entrepreneurship side, I think that's great, because I've been on a number of nonprofit boards, and most of them have been actually really good organizations. And I learned a lot from seeing what a well-run nonprofit looks like, as well as some of the challenges that exist, even in that realm of things. And I think that bringing the discipline that we've started to see grow up around entrepreneurship and startups and whatnot to that area, I think is great, because there's no question there's plenty of world problems to be solved that, for various reasons, are just beyond the scale, the scope, or the profit motives of for-profit companies.
Well, it's hip and cool to be an entrepreneur these days, It's a completely irrational act to start a company because the odds are against you. Despite all the success stories you read, as Bryan tells us, there's no such thing as instant success. Entrepreneurship is still a long, arduous journey, and for any company to become great, it requires you to have that blend of data and insights to understand your who, what, when, where, how, and why. And while in the past, it was your experience and instinct navigating you through, in today's world of machine learning and AI, the data is more expansive and available. So you now have the ability to rapidly experiment and learn. But you've still got to ask the right questions to get the right data and use your intuition to piece that information together in order to move you forward in the right direction. And in talking to Bryan, I was also curious to understand if he felt the entrepreneurial mindset has evolved and even what it takes to be successful in building a new business today.
I don't think it's changed. I read a definition. Ted Turner may have said this. It was an article about Ted Turner, and he may have said this, or it was said in the article, but it just grabbed my attention. It's always stuck in my head, which is an entrepreneur is somebody who sees the same, he's looking at the same problem or the same set of things as other people and sees the risk differently because they have either a unique insight or some unique information about that situation that they see the risk as being substantially less than other people do. And that's, people see something, they say, oh, that's too risky, so they don't do it. We always ask ourselves, Chief, why didn't I think of that? Or why wasn't it that way? Why wasn't that done a long time ago? Well, it's because anyone who thought about it for various reasons, the circumstances were such they thought it was too risky. But an entrepreneur is somebody who comes along and either because there's new technology available that they can see how it can be applied to this problem in a way that wasn't possible before, or so they have other information or they have some other unique insight. That's how they see that problem and they go after it. I think the second thing is you've got to really be willing to sacrifice to make that happen and be willing to make that sacrifice. And I also think it really, the other thing I often say is if you're going to be irrational, you've then got to be, do unnatural acts. And not only do you have to do unnatural acts or make those sacrifices, if you will, to make something happen, you got to convince other people to do the same thing because you can't do it by yourself. There's no company that's ever been created that didn't take a team of people and a group of people working together to make it happen. And so you've got to get people who are all equally irrational and equally willing to do unnatural acts to make something happen. So culture is critically important and the team is critically important. So I think one of the key aspects of entrepreneurship that people maybe overlook is you've got to be a great team builder. And being a great team builder starts with having a very clear idea about what kind of culture you're going to have, how the company's going to operate and behave, and then hiring people who are going to match that and who are going to embrace that and are going to go behave and act that way.
Do you think that there are still common myths and misconceptions? One of which you already had mentioned, just, oh yeah, it's an instant success and that's not going to be that hard. But are there any other ones that you see are quite pervasive with entrepreneurs today?
I think there's too much focus, and I hope this is a thing that will change with time, is in new generations that come along. But I think there's too much focus on fame and fortune and making a ton of money really fast, as opposed to building an enduring company.
What's driving that?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the press has a lot to do with it. Like anything, same reason that drove everyone rushing out to California for the gold rush back in 47, right?
Yeah.
There's gold in them hills. Well, unfortunately, what you didn't realize is it's a lot of work to get that gold out of those hills. And so the smart people started making blue jeans and shovels, or they figured out how to, corral capital like the Hearst and all of those folks did, and created huge fortunes. But for every one of the big four, the California Big Four, that became, very wealthy individuals in natural resources. There were, hundreds of thousands of people who came to California that didn't, right? So, it hasn't changed. I think the only thing that's really different is the clock speed. This concept of 4 martini lunches blows my mind. How did people do that back in the 60s, the Mad Men days? I mean, I don't know how they did that. I think it's just the clock speed. Beyond that, I think I don't think much has changed in what it takes. It takes having a deep understanding of a problem, or in some cases, a technology that you create that's new, and then figuring out how to apply it to and create a market for it. It takes being a great visionary. It takes being a great leader. It takes being, and I say leader versus manager, because management and leadership are two different things. And what's critical in a startup and early on is that leadership, because you've got to convince people to really make sacrifices to make something happen. And that's leadership. That's not management. And so, management's, making sure they get the most out of you between 9 and 5. Leadership is having people working 20 hours a day and loving it. That's sort of the difference between the two.
Do you think that's one of the core things that most entrepreneurs lack to be able to successfully scale and move at the pace that they want to?
Well, the successful ones don't lack it, but the ones that aren't successful, that's probably one of the things that have contributed to their inability to ultimately be a successful entrepreneur. And, you've definitely got to be a promoter, and it's a very fine line. You've got to be able to promote your idea, to sell your idea, to get people to believe in your idea, to potentially suspend disbelief around something that this can actually be done. But, as we all know, at some point along that spectrum or that line, you shift over into, snake oil salesmen and, the like. You get into, hustling, and, the word promotion is not necessarily seen as a positive term, right? Over promotional, et cetera. And it's because, sometimes somebody's actually very good at convincing people to do something that isn't actually possible. So there's a very fine line there, but that's certainly one of the skills that you have to have. And I think at the end of the day, you have to want to build something great. It's not about the money. It's not about creating wealth and whatnot. That's the side benefit. That's the measure, how you measure how well you did. But the real test is, did you build something great and enduring and lasting?
When it comes to this up-and-coming generation of entrepreneurs, those Gen Zers, Bryan sees some interesting dynamics.
Actually, I have a lot of confidence and faith in Gen Z. I'm working with a lot of Gen Z folks, and I see a noticeable difference from the prior generation in terms of their attitude, in terms of their approach. They're very hardworking. They don't feel like the world owes them. They don't feel like, they should be rewarded regardless of whether they actually produce something or were successful or not. They're scared. They're afraid. They're very worried about the future, and they think that they have to make their own future. That, what they're coming into is not necessarily in great shape or, set up to take care of them and whatnot. And so I think they have a much more of a sense of self-responsibility and accountability than I've seen in earlier generations. And I'm pretty heartened by it, actually. They're just nose down, go to work, and get it done. And I think that's I think that it returns in a lot of ways to the roots of the great entrepreneurs.
Do you think it's fair to say that in today's business, everyone needs to think like an entrepreneur, given the speed at which everything is moving?
I think everyone needs to think like a business owner, meaning everyone should take responsibility and accountability for the organization they're in, regardless of what position you're in. And that doesn't mean you get to go tell everyone what to do or whatever. But in building the culture of my last company, one of the things that was in the cultural guidelines was, this is your company too. You are as responsible for the culture as anyone else. If you don't like something, speak up. Do something about it. So I think that sense of responsibility is really key. And own the company, own the culture, own what's going on, and act and think like you own the business as much as anyone else does. And that, by the way, is always great advice if you want to move up in a company, because I guarantee you that gets recognized by the CEO and the senior execs and the board, because that's exactly what they want.
And it also sounds like, of other points that you made, is that to be that successful entrepreneur, not only having that ownership, but constantly need to be a voracious learner and always asking the why.
Yeah, absolutely. A guy that was responsible for one of the largest M&A mergers, software mergers in Silicon Valley, was a very interesting guy. And if you had a 1 hour meeting with him, if he spoke 5 minutes of that meeting, that was unusual. He would ask a question or two or three and just listen to what you had to say. And he made you speak and talk most of the time. And he would just suck your brain dry. So literally every opportunity he got, he was always trying to learn from people, from books, from whatever. It absolutely pays off. So absolutely critical.
Well, and another thing I also picked up from what you said, you have to listen. Not everybody listens and can absorb the constructive feedback that may be provided in order to move forward. So learning also means listening.
Well, and exactly to what you just said about constructive feedback and whatnot. It's not listening and listening in a what's the right word? In a constructive way, so that you can take criticism and you're okay with your ideas being trashed or your ideas being invalidated, because it's not about that. It's about finding the truth. It's about finding out what the market really needs and wants and what the market's willing to accept. And that's what's really key.
Now, I love that. That was great.
Well, I'll give you another one. I'll give you an example. And this actually comes from a CEO of one of companies I'm on the board of. We were recently talking about this problem. And he said, here's the problem with talking to the market and customers. Or there's several, but here's one, which is if you go to somebody and say, okay, on Sunday, the garage is a mess. You can't even get your car in the garage. So on Sunday, there's a football game or there's your garage. What are you going to do on Sunday? What should you do on Sunday? I should clean the garage. And then they go watch the football game instead. So there's what you should do or want, and there's what you really do and behave. And I think a lot of times one of the challenges for entrepreneurs is understanding that difference. It's not about what people say they want. It's about what they'll actually do.
As Bryan shared, the fundamentals around what an entrepreneur is, what their mindset should be, and what it takes to be successful haven't changed, despite developments in the ability and need to get to market quickly. An entrepreneur still sees how a problem can be solved differently and views it with a different level of risk compared to others, is willing to do unnatural acts, as Bryan likes to call it, and is willing to make sacrifices. But to realize this vision, one has to be a great leader and promoter who gets other people on board who are also equally irrational and willing to do those unnatural acts, is a great team builder with a clear definition of culture and how they want to operate, and hires only people who align to those principles as they build and scale. As an entrepreneur, you're always listening, learning, and asking the why, because you have to find that all-important truth. And everyone you bring in needs to operate that way because they all need to think like business owners. It's about defining the market product fit and not the other way around. The focus has to be about building something great and lasting versus fame and fortune. And one more perspective Bryan adds is around the role of the investor in this process, as he's been on both sides as a company founder and now a venture capitalist.
I get lots of feedback and discussion from entrepreneurs. And, the two biggest complaints they always had have been, continue to be, one, venture capitalists aren't straight with me. They don't tell me. what I need to know. They don't tell me what they're really thinking. They're not great about setting expectations. And the second big problem they complain about is my board's not very good. And what they're really saying is, I don't have, especially from my investors, typically, there are absolutely exceptions, but typically I don't have people that have been there, done that before. So in many cases, they're watching the same movie as me at the same time and have no better insights than I've got. And any insights they have are, from other companies they've sat on boards at, which is a bit removed from the realities of what really goes on and what you have to deal with on a daily basis. And even so things as simple as management. You'd be hard pressed to find a venture capitalist who's managed more than 10 people. So the value of operators in the venture capital side of things is been there, done that, live the movie, understand the challenges and what happens along the way in an intimate way, and can really resonate with the entrepreneur and understand what they're going through. That doesn't necessarily make me more sympathetic, but it does make me more empathetic. meaning I understand what you're going through.
I'm going to tell you the truth.
Here's what I've seen. Here's what I've seen. Here's things I've seen people try. I've tried, and here's things to think about. Let's keep talking about it, see if we can, help you figure it out. But at the end of the day, this is a business where you walk in the door and you ask for a lot of money, and it's real money, and it's money from investors who, in most cases, are foundations and endowments and whatnot. So that money matters to those people, and they're trying to do whatever good their mission and charter is with that money. So they're investing it so they can do even more good. So that money actually matters. And you say you're going to do X, Y, and Z. Well, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And, as an investor, part of our challenge is to make sure we're talking and giving money to somebody who, actually is taking accountability and responsibility for it and knows how to go do X, Y, and Z, or is smart enough to build an organization that can figure out how to go do it and has the skills and abilities to go do that.
So to close, how has Bryan's definition of career success evolved since his early days in the workforce to now?
Well, I didn't know what the hell I was talking about in the early days. You don't know the reality until, although, at that time, the world in a lot of ways and organizations were still very much tended to be a command and control kind of place. The world today is very different. One of the lessons I learned early on was how the most important word in the English language is probably why. Understanding why something is being done, why somebody has this idea, why they're trying to accomplish this, understanding, why is so critical, because too often we're presented with what? Here's what I want. But if I knew why you wanted it, what you were actually trying to accomplish, I might actually know something you don't and have a completely different way to approach the problem that might be much cheaper, faster, and better. And I think one of the things that millennials have really brought to the workforce and the organizations is they're pretty insistent on asking why. And I remember I think one of the worst things we used to do in child rearing was, what's one of the first words that children learn and continue to use as toddlers and whatnot? It's why.
No and why.
Yeah. Exactly. No and why. And of course, what do parents do? They beat it out of them. Don't ask me why, just do it. Why is so we learn. We're taught and we're learned to not ask why, and that's terrible because why is so fundamentally important to everything. And if an organization embraces why, and not in a confrontational way, but in a I want to understand so I can do a better job way, it is going to be so much more effective. And I think that's really one of the biggest benefits of millennials in the workforce is they're much more insistent on that why and understanding that. And they should understand why. And the organization should want them to understand why, because they're going to be better employees and do better work if they understand why.
So then would you say that how you've learned to define your career success is constantly asking even more of the why. Maybe you weren't aware of that earlier on, but now you know that is just core to how you view yours or anybody that you mentor. Their business success is the why.
100%. And Andy Grove, very smart man. Another one of his favorite things to say was ask the next question, which is another form of saying asking why. And when somebody gives you an answer, then you dig deeper and you dig deeper and you dig deeper. And that whole exercise is to get to the why. Ultimately, why do you want to do this? Why do you want this to happen? So I can do a better job of fulfilling your expectations and your needs.
It seems like once you understand the why, then you are much better equipped to map out the how.
Oh, absolutely. The how and the what and the when and everything.
What's some of the best work advice you've ever gotten and why?
Well, one was from Jerry Goldrich, who was kind of one of the original corporate turnaround guys. He and his company did over 150 of them, I think, in his heyday, half of them public companies. And one thing he said really stuck with me, which was when you start to feel in your tummy that somebody is not up to the job, is struggling with the job, maybe isn't the right person for the job, you're 6 months late. And it's so critical to really continually assess your team and understand where they are. And one of the things that I've learned is you should respect loyalty and you should reward loyalty. But you don't have to respect and reward loyalty by keeping somebody in a job that they're starting to fail at and it's just going to get worse. That's hurtful to them. That's not helpful. That's not rewarding them. That's hurting them. And so, always being on top of where your team is and making sure they're in the right jobs. And if they're not, then finding the right opportunity for them, whether that be in your organization or somewhere else. So you should absolutely respect and reward that loyalty, but it doesn't have to be by giving them more and more responsibility they can't handle. And I think one of the challenges, there's kind of an old maxim, which may or may not be true anymore, but I suspect it still is, which is an organization can't grow more than 30% a year on a sustained basis. It will come apart the seams at some point. In Silicon Valley, in the startup world, wherever you are, we move much faster than that at the early stages. We're growing 100, 200, 300% a year. That pace of growth, and I think that 30% growth for organizations in a lot of ways reflects kind of the human baseline ability to learn and to mature and to develop. And so when you get these organizations that are growing 100, 200, 300%, it doesn't take long to outstrip somebody's experience and ability to learn. And the fact that they can't keep up with that pace and that very few individuals can is not their fault. It's not, bad on them. It's just the way it is. And so then you need to go get people who have more experience and have seen those movies that you're now experiencing and know how to deal with it and know how to help the company continue to grow and whatnot. But you still got to take care of those people that got you to where you were. And I think one of the interesting challenges we have in the startup world and the fast growing companies is how do you create a culture where, it's okay for the job to outgrow you. And in fact, if it doesn't outgrow you, the company's doing something wrong. But how do you put in place a system and a set of processes to make sure those same people continue to have opportunities and continue to get to grow so that at some point they get those opportunities to take over for somebody who has, exceeded what they know and what they're, capable of managing and handling.
Absolutely. I think it's great. Well, I kind of look at this as, with even my own experience or many of the things that I see is that folks don't think of their pipeline, so to speak, or even backlog, if you want to use a technical term, of talent. And it's working with the talent that you have right now, not forecasting the future and not being able to flex up and down, left and right, a lot more seamlessly to adapt to the situation that you need. And so you tend to rely on what you have, or you just deal with what you have, and it becomes really hard to look at things in a different way and just break it apart and say what's working, what's not. Because it becomes too easy to focus on the task at hand and needing to get the task done versus going back to your point, understanding why the task or objective or goal isn't being delivered or solved at the rate or in the way that's the most ideal. And it becomes very easy to just kind of get mired in that box. And the last question, well, there's two more. To close, what advice would you tell your younger self?
Get more leadership and management experience earlier. At the end of the day, nothing happens without a team of people. So becoming as good as you can be at leading and managing as early as possible is great. I did have the joy and privilege, I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, of managing several intramural and city league softball and flag football teams in college. And, you want to learn a lot about managing people, manage a bunch of college kids.
Oh, yeah.
It was a good start. It was far from enough or sufficient, but it was a good start. So, anything and everything you can do to develop and learn management leadership skills as early as possible is critical. Because you know what, nobody's a born manager, and there aren't that many born leaders. I think leadership can absolutely be developed. It's what the military academies are all about, is teaching people how to lead. So it can absolutely be taught and learned for the most part. And so just, every chance and opportunity you've got to learn and develop those skills, because, again, nothing happens without a group of people working together.
And finally, what's the best way listeners can connect with you?
On Twitter, it's at bstolle, Stolle. You can find me there. On LinkedIn, just Bryan with a Y, D Stolle, or just Stolle, I guess, Bryan with a Y, Stolle. And then B Stolle, BSTOLE at wildcat.vc.
Well, thank you so much for your time today and your great perspective on entrepreneurship, which is about finding that truth by understanding the why.
There you go. Good summary. Thank you. Appreciate it.
With all the hype, the coolness factor, and perceptions of immediate fame and fortune around entrepreneurship, I wanted to understand how and why entrepreneurship has seemingly changed over the years. At least, that's what I thought until speaking with Bryan. It was interesting to learn that the reality is that not much really has. The fundamentals are still the fundamentals, yet they've gotten lost along the way. And that is a recurring theme we've been hearing from many of our guests on various topics we've covered. It all still comes down, though, to understanding the basics. I loved Bryan's point that it simply starts with the customer. In marketing, that's our foundation. And if you don't understand who you're trying to serve, what they want, why they want it, and how you can solve the problem, then nothing really matters. Entrepreneurship is hard, and that level of commitment, persistence, and insistence around achieving your vision takes guts. And oftentimes, the end outcome I've personally seen isn't the glory that many had hoped for. What I've also learned is that not only do you have to be a voracious learner and ask the why, but to me, that means you have to have that growth mindset around everything you do. It's the only way you're going to find that traction to propel you forward and fast. And that's the case whether you're a small business, entrepreneur, or startup founder. So you have to be agile and pivot based on what your data and insights tell you. And leading your cause is crucial. It's your passion, your purpose, that others have to get on board with. Because building something great can't be about the money. It's got to be built to last. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. You can connect with Bryan on Twitter at bstolle. That's BSTOLLE. By email at bstolle@wildcat.vc or find him on LinkedIn. If you've liked what you heard, please share this podcast with friends and colleagues. To get show notes, links, and more tips and advice from this episode, you can visit us at strategicmomentum.co. There, you can contribute your own tips to the work and career advice we've collected over the years. And if you want to learn more about how to best set up your startup business for success, check out our episode with Bruce Cleveland, Bryan's partner at Wildcat Ventures. In that episode, which is number 60, he shares his valuable traction gap framework that outlines the critical principles, milestones, and metrics that are foundational to create the necessary momentum you need. And don't forget to follow Strategic Momentum on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and Instagram. You can also join the Facebook community by searching Strategic Momentum in groups. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.